Hi, I'm Ryan Bothwell. I'm an assembly lead. Today we're going to be working on an F18 double bearing frame that is oil filled versus grease filled. We're going to have our wet end bearing, our drive in bearings. We got our frame, of course. We got the gaskets for the oil filled. We got a bearing cover. We got 4 lip seals. We got the breather, a sight glass, a plug, the bracket insert ring, the bracket, the lock nut, the lock washer, and the shaft. What we do is we'll start out by washing all the parts, check the inside of the frame for any excess casting or casting sand. We don't want that in the frame. Same with the F16 frame. You don't want anything that's going to fall out, get into the bearings. It'll cause your frame bearings not to last as long. So we also go through and we'll deburr the edges of this. The place that puts them in primer for us, or once in a while they'll get some into where the seals go, so we gotta make sure that's clear of that stuff so the seals will seal properly. Then we'll just deburr any sharp edges that are left on the frame parts and be able to put it together smoothly and efficiently. So some of the tools we'd use to clean out the frames would be a needle gun. It helps get in the corners where most of the casting sand is. Not every frame has excess casting sand in it, but some do. So you need to pay attention and kind of make sure that there's none in there. And then if there's a bunch built up on the sides, which is rare, we just use a simple patch grinder and go in there and just knock it out. It usually takes a couple minutes to clean one out if they're dirty. It's not really too much time to ensure that your bearings will last longer. The solvent we use to clean out our frames is provided to us by Safety Clean. It's just a basic solvent degreaser. Any kind of solvent or brake clean or anything like that that you can get a hold of, it will work satisfactory to clean out the frames and the parts. What you're looking for is you just want to get all the excess oils and grit and stuff off the parts. So anything that'll do that will work fine. We're going to go into installing some lip seals in our bearing cover. This being an oil-filled frame, it'll take 2 lip seals in back-to-back configuration, which means the lips of your seals one will be facing up and the other one will be facing in towards the bearings. And what that's going to do is that's going to be able to hold the grease in between the lip seals, but then at the same time not letting oil or debris get into between the lip seals or come out of the bearing frame and leak oil out of the deal. If this was just a grease-filled frame, we'd put 1 lip seal in and we'd put it lip out, so it'd look like that. And that's the same for engine mounts too. Basically, you want the grease that you pump in to get into your bearings. So there's a grease zerk hole right here. We'll put a grease zerk in there, and then that's how you'll be able to lube up your lip seals in between your lip seals. To install our lip seals, we just use a basic sealed install tool, flat piece of metal. Put the lip seal on there. Then you just knock it in until it's solid. If this was grease filled, we'd be done because the grease filled will only take 1 lip seal. Then when it's oil filled, we'll flip it over and we'll install the second one. That one installs the same way. So both of your lip seals are back to back, lip in and lip out with the greaser. What we do is we'll put a dab of grease on 4 spots to hold our gasket on there. We're going to go ahead and install our lip seals in our bracket. So the lip seals go in the same way, face the same direction. So once again, if this was a grease filled, we'd be all done. Takes the one lip seal on a grease filled frame. You'll notice the lip seal doesn't quite go in there, so we gotta, where your bracket insert ring comes in. And this is gonna go in, and then your lip seal will go in there. So after you install that, you want to blow this out just to make sure there's no metal shavings in there. Then you just go ahead with your lip seal. This is what the front bearing is going to look like. Also, if this was a single bearing frame or a single bearing F16 frame, your bearing is going to look pretty similar to this. Your double bearings are going to have a shoulder on one side, and then they're going to have a cage on the other. So we put these in a back-to-back configuration, which we call this the back of the bearing. So they're going to go onto the shaft like that. And the reason for that is because this shoulder is going to butt up against the shoulder of the shaft, and this is also where the lock nut's going to hold on to the bearings to hold them tight against the shaft. If you put them on backwards, as in this way, you're not going to be able to get a proper endo out of the frame, and your lock nut's not going to go on right. You're going to have all kinds of problems, and it's probably going to end up locking up your bearings, and you won't even be able to turn it with nothing in it. So the front bearing, we just tap it in to install it into the front. We always put the numbers out. That way, if you guys ever need to order new bearings or whatever, you can just pull off the bracket and look inside and see what the numbers are. That way you don't have to take the whole frame apart to figure out what bearings you have. You just want to gently tap on the outer race. Then it'll get to a point where it just slides right in. Want to make sure it spins. You don't want it to feel too loose in there. If you have slop, your frame could either be worn out around the outer race, or it could be not machined correctly, but this one feels pretty snug, so it should be good. So what we get to use in here is we use a press plate, and it's got a 30 thousandth shoulder on it, which helps locate this bearing inside the frame. So there's a 30 thou difference between the bearing and the face of the frame. So if you're in the field, you're not going to probably have the luxury of one of these. So you can either use the shims that are behind, that are on the bearing, the drive-in side, to put in here to stack up to 30 thou so you have a nice flat surface to press against. Or you can always do the alternative, which is get it all put together and take this off and see if you can maybe turn the frame over and just press the bearing in the rest of the way onto the shaft. So either way, if you don't get this in all the way and on the shoulder of the shaft, you're going to have a discrepancy in your measurement for your endo. And if you do that, it could be either too tight and wear your bearings out faster, or it could wear out your frame components. So you want to try to get something that's 30 thou in here. That way everything's seated nice and correctly. So we're just going to go ahead and bolt this plate on. We're going to install our breather, our plug, and our sight glass for the oil-filled frame. The grease-filled frame won't have a sight glass. It'll just have two plugs that'll go on this side. So we'll install our breather at the top, our plug at the bottom, and our sight glass will go on the top of the two on this side. I'm just using a generic Permatex thread sealant. You can use thread tape if you don't have this. You don't want to tighten the sight glasses too tight. You just want to make sure you get them in there nice and snug. If you tighten them too tight, you can actually break the glass in there. So after you tighten them, you kind of want to check out the glass, make sure there's no cracks in it, because then your oil could leak out of there. So I just installed some plugs in the top of this. Our frames are universal, and by universal I mean we can use this exact same frame on a Ready Prime, or we can use it on just a regular standard frame. So if we're not going to use it for a Ready Prime, we'll just put plugs in the top so it doesn't build up with stuff from pumpage or whatever. So from here I'm going to flip this up and stand it up, and then I'm going to heat these two bearings that go on the shaft. We'll heat these up, get them on there, use the lock nut to tighten everything up, and then we'll drop the shaft in. I use a crane, they're really heavy. Had a guy throw his back out once trying to put a double bearing shaft in, so you want to make sure you're using the proper lifting equipment at all times. This stuff's pretty heavy. We just use an induction bearing heater, like the one back here. We let it heat up. We use a 213 degree temperature stick to make sure that the race of the bearing's hot enough. That's what our engineering department recommends, to be able to slide the bearing over the shaft. So if you don't have one of those nifty induction bearing heaters, I've heard of guys using oxyacetylene torches to heat up the inner races to get them to go on. I've seen guys just go ahead and just press them all on. Anything you can use, if you decide to press them on, you want to make sure everything's nice and straight so you're not cocking anything or getting anything sideways. Things to look for if you're tearing one down to rebuild it. You want to check your tolerances in here to make sure they're not oversized or there's any sufficient scoring. You also can check your engine bracket and your bearing cover to make sure that the bearings haven't slammed against it and caused enough wear to cause the bearing frame not to be properly shimmed for longevity. Make sure your oil is clean. If you're running oil filled, if you're lube filled, you want to refer to your manual on what the lubricating practices are. Same with the lip seals on this. Each pump's a little different depending on how much axial load, how much in play and everything's supposed to have. So your manual, it comes with the frames, or if you have questions, you can always call the sales department here or the engineering department. They can get you on the right track. So as you can see, that big shoulder is on the shoulder of the shaft. I hold them on there until they kind of stop spinning. If I can grab the inner race and spin it on the shaft, it needs to cool down a little more before it'll grab. So that bearing's grabbed. So I'll go ahead and heat up the second one. If we were doing a grease-filled frame, you can take and you can slide this back a little bit, and the cage will kind of come back a little bit. We used to use a general grease gun. You want to make sure you grease in between all the balls really good. That way you can pack the bearings with grease. You can also do the same thing with the front one before you put it into the frame. Just take the back side of it and just grease it up really good. That way you can make sure you have efficient grease in there when you're installing the pump. If you do an uh-oh and you happen to install this backwards, you want to make sure you get it off. If you're using it if you're heating it up, usually you'll realize it and you can pull it off really fast. If not, you can tap it off with a hammer. We use bronze hammer and then blow out the bearing to make sure there's nothing in there. The most suggested way to do it would be to use a press, but not everybody has access to a press. Or you can just heat the inner race back up for using a torch and it'll heat it up enough. You can slide it back off and turn it around. All right, so we've got our second bearing on. We're going to put the lock washer on first. There's a tang on the lock washer and there's a groove on the shaft, so you want to make sure you line those up. We use a nickel, jet lube, anti-seize, any kind of anti-seize works. You just want to kind of put some on the threads. You want to put a little bit on that lock washer so the lock washer will be able to roll instead of catching that. Just want to run it on there by hand. We have spanner wrench. You don't want to beat on this because what can happen is you can get your spanner wrench caught on the lock washer and you can actually move the lock washer and break that tang off. So you don't really need to beat on it. Once they get tight, you'll hear the difference in the sound, and then that'll ensure that it's got a nice tight fit. So the next step is to look for a tang that you can bend over into that lock washer. So I need to go a little bit more. So right there is where we bend our tang over in our lock washer, and that'll help that from spinning. So after you get this together, you want to make sure that these bearings won't spin opposite of each other. So they're pretty tight together. They're still kind of warm. Lots of people like to cool them down. It's not really necessary as long as you get them tight. So then we'll go ahead and put an eye bolt in this end of the shaft, and we'll lift it up with the crane. We'll drop it right into the frame. Then we'll go ahead to the press and press it in. Now we've got our pump, our frame build in our press. We use a spacer to kind of take up a little bit of the space between the hydraulic ram and the shaft. If this were to be a single bearing frame, you'd want to put something over the shaft that would sit on the race of the bearing. So you're pressing on the race of the bearing and the shaft. If you just push on the shaft, if that bearing's not straight, it'll just push the shaft through and the bearing will pop off. Being as this has a lock nut, so the shaft and everything is pushing on the bearings, it's not necessary for us to use something to push on the inner race. So that's why we'll just use the spacer on this. I'm going to go ahead and make sure everything's lined up good. Then as you can see, it's starting to fall in. We're up to about 2,000 pounds if you have a press. If not, if you don't have a press, just go ahead and push it all the way in until it stops moving. So now we got our shaft pushed in, everything's good. Make sure it turns, everything turns real nice. We'll go ahead and take our press plate off. If you don't have the luxury of that, you can also use the bracket. You just want to make sure you get that 30th shoulder stacked up so this will seat right against the end of the shaft. So our bracket's going to have two different, kind of a top and a bottom. The bottom's going to have a drain hole on it, and the top isn't. So you want to make sure you put the bottom on the bottom. I just take a little bit of grease and grease up the lip seals just a little bit before I put it on, just to help it slide on. That grease we put on here earlier is going to help hold that gasket in place when we slide this on. You want to go ahead and anti-seize up your bolts. You just go ahead and tighten your bracket. There's not a torque spec on this, so we just use an impact, but if you don't have impact, you can just use a wrench, tap it with a hammer until it's nice and tight. Once again, you want to turn it, make sure it spins, make sure nothing got bound up make sure the gasket didn't fall and get into the shaft or the bearing or in between the lip seal somehow. So it still turns really good. So there's a couple different ways you can do the next step. We like to stand them up. That way we know everything's fallen completely to the bottom. We're going to take a measurement from our bearing and our frame to the shoulder and the face of this. See what kind of in-play we have. On a double bearing F18 frame, it's a recommended 2 to 7 thousandths endo. On an F18 single bearing frame, it's a recommended 5 or 7 to 12 thousandths endo. And on an F16 single bearing frame, it's a recommended 7 to 12 thousandths endo as well. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to measure our endo. How we do that is this particular dial indicator, you start here, you're going to zero it out here, and then you're going to measure from the bearing to the face of the frame. Some of the gauges go backwards, where you'll start from the bearing to the face of the frame to here. This one happens to go the other direction, so we'll go ahead and we'll zero this out. So we're right there at 0. Then we'll go ahead and take our measurement in here. We're right at 6 thousandths. So that's within our 2 to 7 thousandths endo. If we needed to shim it, we have a few different shims here. These thin ones, the brown ones are 10 thou, the blue ones are 5 thou. These would be for the F18. And then if you're doing an F16, again, the blue ones are 5, the brown ones are 10, and these ones are a little bit thicker. The bearing's a little bit bigger in this, so we use a thinner shim on these, and you don't want the shim to cover up where the grease is going to be going in or the flow of the oil through the bearing. So if this one doesn't need any shims, we won't put any in it. We'll kind of grease our lip seals up just a little bit here. On this particular bearing cover, you want to make sure the zerk's at the top so you can get to it. Again, you want to anti-seat your bolts. And again, there's no torque spec on this end, so you can just tighten these up. So now that we have our frame together, we're going to go ahead and grease the lip seals up. The grease reused is just a Shell standard grease. It's nothing special. It's the same thing we grease our bearings with. We have a few pumps that take a full synthetic grease, but it's a custom order type application thing. So you just want to go ahead and go with your Zerk there. When you're pumping this in, you kind of want to spin the shaft at the same time. And then a little bit of grease is going to start coming out the face of the lip seal. And that means you have enough grease in between your lip seals. If it's a bearing frame, where we're not greasing lip seals, we're actually greasing bearings, we'll pump grease in through the Zerk, and we'll just twist the shaft until it kind of gets a little bit harder to turn, and that's a sufficient amount of grease. So as you can see right here, we're starting to get some grease coming out of the lip seal. That means we have a sufficient amount of grease in between the lip seals on this side. We're going to do the same thing for the back side as well. Just go ahead and pump and turn. There, that grease is coming out again. So as you do that, you'll feel the pump get easier to turn, because then you got grease on your lip seals, and then the shaft gets really free to turn. All of our oil lube frames are sent dry. We don't put any oil in them at the factory. Every pump, though, new pump, comes with an owner's manual. It's going to tell you how much and what kind of oil that you need to install in these. It's different for every oil lube frame, just depending on what your application is. So you want to refer back to that so you get the right amount of oil and the right kind of oil into your bearings.